So if I can just go back to the documents we were looking at before lunch, Shomic WITN 2658008. I had been about to say before lunch that there was a response from Dr. Main to this letter. That's incorrect. What I had in mind was Dr. Main's explanation within the letter. So she describes her policy about asking patients if they want to know the result, and then a reference to her practice in relation to spouses being tested. And then she says in the last paragraph, I've been trying to keep the panic situation at the minimal level throughout the province's haemophilic population, hence this practice. Quite how that's an explanation of the policy or practice is unclear, but I just wanted to make clear that's what Dr. Main says in the letter itself as opposed to in any particular statement. More generally, it is apparent from materials that the inquiry has examined that Dr. Main was alive to the issues relating to confidentiality and stigma. And we can see that, for example, from BHCT 40981. This is a letter from January 1986 to a GP about an individual infected with HTLV3. But if we just look at the bottom of the page and what she's written in handwriting at the very bottom, phone call to GP, extreme need of confidentiality. We can see that also in RHSC 5040_050. This is the meeting of something called the Hiv Advisory Group of the Eastern Health and Social Services Board. It's their second meeting in October 1986, and we can see that Dr. Main is one of the attendees. If we go to page 3, picking it up in the 4th and 5th paragraphs, we can see that the discussion refers to the confidentiality of information on AIDS patients. It's an important matter. The media are only entitled to historic information, e.g. at 6-monthly intervals about number of cases and number of deaths. And then in the next paragraph, Dr. Main is recorded as raising the possibility of telephonists being able to listen to conversations, and that we should be careful about what we say over the telephone, and a suggestion of staff education also being directed towards telephonists so they're aware of the importance of confidentiality. More generally, in her witness statement at WITN 0736009, page 36. She talks at the bottom of the page, last paragraph, lack of knowledge within the general population and the limited experience of many individuals led me to suggest that patients should not publicise their results unnecessarily. And again, that chimes with some of the oral and written testimony the inquiries received. I should also note, if we look at the next page, I omitted to take you earlier to a rather more detailed explanation or account of the January 1985 onwards meetings from Dr. Main in this statement. So I will, if I may, just invite you to look at the bottom half of this page and then over the page. She says this at paragraph 54.1, when the HIV/AIDS tragedy was evolving in the 1980s, to be told of a positive HIV test was in essence a death sentence. There was no treatment. Patients were terrified. Likewise, relatives and friends were bewildered and frightened. I gave much thought to the planning of how to achieve the essential HIV testing. Finally, I agreed to have group meetings, 3 in total. All patients who'd been treated were invited to attend, with the exception of the paediatric patients who were looked after by their haematologist. The prime aim of the meetings was to provide information about the global situation, and secondly, to inform patients of the local situation, in particular, the mode of transmission from person to person and its effect on day-to-day living of those concerned. Information about care was given to friends and relations. It was suggested to be careful, as the general public was not well informed about modes of transmission and infectivity. So again, that's the suggestion of keeping these matters confidential. And then she says, in terms, finally, there was a need to address confidentiality, lack of which gave great concern to the patients. The format of the meetings was that I gave an introduction. Thereafter, there was time for an informal chat over a cup of tea. Again, that's not consistent, I think, with some of the accounts we have of at least, including Dr. Main's own account of at least one of the meetings. And finally, the testing.
That was the third meeting in the old lecture theatre.
Precisely. And finally, the testing would take place. So that again suggests that the expectation was that those who were present at the meeting would immediately be tested. My sources of information regarding HIV infection were multiple. The UK HCDO AIDS Working Party, chaired by Dr. Ritzer, provided copies of all publications as and when they appeared. This information was invaluable. Now, I'll need to double check, sir, but my recollection is that the UK HCDO's AIDS group was set up for the first time, or met for the first time in January 1985. So it's unlikely that there had been much produced by that stage. Of course, as the months went on, the AIDS group did meet on several occasions during 1985, so more might have been produced. She says this information was invaluable. Secondly, information gained through combined monthly meetings with colleagues in Scotland. And thirdly, in an informal manner, through conversations with my colleagues with whom I'd worked in the USA, Australia and Europe. In a different context, I also had regular discussions with my STD colleagues. She then refers in the next paragraph to going from time to time to London for meetings. Again, I think that's potentially looking forward in time. And then in paragraph 54.5, she returns to the format of the group meetings at the hospital. She says, I presented and explained to patients and relatives the characteristics of the HIV virus. Inside the body cavity and the bloodstream, it was lethal. However, outside the body, the virus was extremely vulnerable. It could be destroyed by a simple wipe of bleach, and certainly heat treatment removed its activity. Therefore, apart from IV, i.e. through treatment, blood transfusion, dirty needles between drug users, there was no way that it could be transmitted except by sexual intercourse. It was easier to transmit it by what could be described as vigorous sexual intercourse. After my introduction, the patients were offered testing. At this point in time, testing was not mandatory. Patients could say yes or no. I had anticipated that most people would accept the opportunity to be tested. They all did. The reason for couching the invitation for testing in this manner was to permit patients to be in full control of their lives, circumstances which sadly would change radically if the tests proved to be positive. They were told that no names would be used, that a coding system would be applied, and that for confidentiality purposes the results would be logged into a confidential notebook. They were asked if they wished to know their result. Contrary to my expectations, one patient declined to hear the result. His response posed a problem. Rapidly, I had to consider the action I would take if this particular patient tested positive. It was recognised that all patients who tested positive would require a confirmatory test. Apart from taking his routine treatment, sexual transmission was the only other means of transmission. Therefore, a short delay before his confirmatory test would not constitute a public health issue. After the testing was completed, I then had a concluding address with the patients. I was acutely aware of the difficulty of imparting unpleasant news to patients. I had been much involved in telling individuals that either they or their close relative was suffering from acute leukemia and all the problems associated with chemotherapy. I well knew from experience that the audience for this type of introductory session would perhaps remember as much as 25% of what they were told, and it was unlikely that they would remember more than 50%. Therefore, it seemed important to me to reiterate to them exactly how their lifestyle might change in the future if they'd experienced transmission of the virus. I also asked them to refrain from sexual activity before they came back for their results. They were aghast and there was some laughter at this, but the purpose was to protect spouses and partners and the general public. So that's Dr. Main's more detailed account of her recollection in her most recent witness statement. And then over the page, questions were asked about why she about her decision to tell patient their test results only if they wish to be told, and she refers back to the answer above. She's then asked in question 56 about the policy in relation to testing partners, family members, and she says they're following the confirmation of a positive result. Spouses/partners were tested by mutual agreement. And then she's asked about what, if any, information or advice was provided to partners or family members. The response is to say that all relevant information was relayed, either in the centre or at home during a home visit, but it doesn't tell us what information or advice was, as a matter of fact, relayed. But that's as I say, to complete the picture in terms of Dr. Main's evidence on that issue. I've referred to Dr. Main's statement that 15 patients were infected with HIV as a result of the treatment. In fact, if we go back to BHCT 40484, there are 16 patients listed. And then, of course, there is the one additional case of a partner who became infected. So 16 cases of direct infection and one of infection via sexual transmission, presumably, or indirect infection, however one wants to term it. So a total of 17 cases in that regard. Just then, two further documents in relation to the testing process. If we look at BHCT 40158, this is a communication from 21st of August 1985. Results of our latest test for anti-HTLV3 in your patients are as follows. And then there are two identified as positive, and then a series identified as not positive. And then down the bottom of the page, we have no sera in store from, and then there are two patients there identified. So it would appear that the testing process was ongoing for a period of time. If we look over the page, if we look at BHCT 40161, there's a later letter, 12th of September 1985. Again, it provides results of anti-HTLV3 tests in the centre's haemophiliac patients. The first three who are listed as positive, two of those are identified as having already been tested, one by the regional virology lab, which is where this letter emanates from, one by Dr. Tedder, but the second of the three is what appears to be a new result. So again, it would appear that the testing process was still ongoing as at September 1985, and then there's a whole list of patients who are anti-HTLV3 negative. If we can then, just turning to the question of how those patients with HIV were treated, it would appear as though the process for treatment was for their HIV was that they were treated by Dr. Main. There is reference in later statements to arrangements being made for some form of joint clinic or joint arrangement with an infectious diseases specialist, but that looks to be from around 1999 onwards, or indeed a little later than that during Dr. Anderson's tenure. If we go to WITN 3082020, we can see an article in the Ulster Medical Journal. We looked at one yesterday which was about hepatitis B infection in Northern Ireland. This is HIV infection in Northern Ireland 1980 to 1989, and it's published in the Ulster Medical Journal in April 1991. We go to the second page. I should say Dr. Main is identified as one of the authors. Under the heading Methods, The second paragraph tells us that the regional virus laboratory began anti-HIV testing in May 1983, and the Northern Ireland Blood Transfusion... 85, I'm so sorry. And the Northern Ireland Blood Transfusion Service in October 1985. So there is evidence of some test results earlier in 1985, and it may be that those were tests that were undertaken elsewhere. We've seen one reference to a test, for example, by Dr. Tedder, so it may be that sera was sent off to be tested elsewhere. It's not clear. But in any event, in terms of the regional virus laboratory, there's no reason to doubt what's said here, that their process began in May of 1985. We can also see from the next paragraph that it says that retrospective testing of haemophiliacs was done on available sera which had been stored at -20 degrees centigrade in the regional virus laboratory, and fresh sera were obtained from the Department of Haematology, Royal Victoria Hospital. And then if we go to the next page, and we look at the third paragraph, it says the 16 haemophiliacs identified as infected with the virus in 1985, so that doesn't include the one partner, when HIV antibody testing became available, have been cared for by the Northern Ireland Haemophilia Service. Of the 55 remaining persons, 49 have been cared for by the genitourinary medicine services. The remaining 6 have been cared for by other agencies. So that would appear to confirm that their responsibility for their consequences of their HIV infection was retained within the Haemophilia Centre. If we go 2 pages further on, under the heading testing, the second paragraph refers to testing of patients with coagulation defects. So it says 123 patients with coagulation defects who'd received treatment with blood products were tested, and 16 were positive. If only, and that's 13.8%, if only severely affected patients are included, this rises to 25%. So it's not entirely clear why you would include only severely affected patients in one sense, because there were, we've seen 2 examples of patients who were not severely affected, who were infected with HIV. Stored sera were available on 11 of the 16 positive patients, and when tested showed that seroconversion occurred between 1983 and 1985. The source of seroconversion in one patient in 1985 was traced to a batch of heat-treated factor VIII, which was found retrospectively to be contaminated with HIV.
Is that the... do we know if that's the same as we looked at earlier on today, where there had been heat-treated factor VIII? It had been reported as a batch from ARMA where there had been a contributor who subsequently developed AIDS, and the comment made by, I think, Dr. Main was that, thankfully, there's been no seroconversion.
The comment made by Dr. Main, as I understand the position, relates to a patient whose identity I think is known to the inquiry, who was not, as a matter of fact, infected with HIV. I think that's right.
So this is another episode where
it may be the same batch.
Might have been, was in this case implicated.
Yes, yes. So I don't think we've seen anything other than that single letter from ARMA. So it may be that it was a batch used for more than one patient. I don't know. But there is some evidence, Dr. Main's evidence, as I recall, relates to a particular patient who was not infected with HIV. This is, I think, no reason to doubt what's set here in a journal an article co-authored by Dr. Main in 1991, so only a few years after the event, which tells us that there was one heat-treated seroconversion. Who that was, we don't know. We have looked, as you'll recall in the course of today, at a letter which refers to an identification of a patient seroconverting in 1985. Whether it's that patient or a different patient, given that we also know there wasn't an immediate switchover, it would appear, to heat-treated products, is unclear.
Yes.
But in any event, as we see there, evidence that one seroconversion was from heat-treated factor VIII. If we turn over then to page 9, please, Shomik, and look at the second paragraph. This is the position, sorry, second paragraph. That's right. This is the position set out in the second paragraph as at the date of this report. Of the 16 haemophiliac patients infected, 3 have died, 1 by suicide, 1 from liver failure unrelated to HIV infection, and 1 in whom HIV infection was contributory. And then if we go over the page and look at the heading management, we'll see how patients other than haemophiliacs with HIV infection, how their care was managed, mostly been managed as outpatients by the genitourinary medicine service at the Royal Victoria Hospital. Some are recorded as sending clinics elsewhere. These patients have open access to the clinics and the counselling and social services provided at these centres. A designated HIV clinic is in operation at the Royal Victoria Hospital. Inpatient management has mostly been handled by the genitourinary medicine physicians, with close cooperation with relevant specialists, mostly gastroenterology, immunology, neurology and respiratory medicine. There would appear to be a contrast between the multidisciplinary care that appears to have been available to patients other than haemophiliacs with HIV infection, in contrast with those who were haemophiliacs whose care was retained within the haemophilia centre. If we go next to WITN 0736010, again, we've looked at this yesterday for different purposes. It's a 1991 report of activity of the Northern Ireland Regional Centre. If we go to the second page, so this is authored by Dr. Main, and we look at the bottom of the page. Dr. Main says this: it's noteworthy that the visits of HIV-positive patients for counselling by the director of the centre averages 10 visits per month, and many of these visits last up to 2 hours in duration. So a description there of Dr. Main undertaking counselling, but what she means by counselling and what might be meant more generally by counselling may be different matters. Initially, there were 16 HIV-positive haemophilic patients in Northern Ireland. They were all adults, and I've already drawn attention to the fact that one at least seems to have been 14 at the date of testing. By 1991, 3 had already died. We've seen that picked up in the Ulster Medical Journal. We go to the top of the next page. During that year, so 1991, a 4th patient died of Salmonella septicemia directly related to his HIV condition. So that is an update as at 1991 that 4 of the 16 had already died. In terms of what Dr. Main says about the arrangements for the care of those with HIV, if we turn to WITN 0736009, so this is her main statement again, and we go to page 27. If we look at the 3rd and 4th paragraphs, she says the staffing levels in the centre were augmented by an E-grade nurse, a full-time secretary and a scientific officer. The latter was to help with the laboratory side of the situation and possible future research. It's not entirely clear how that assisted with HIV care, but this is her answer in response to a series of questions, a question about what inquiries or investigations were undertaken in respect of the risks of transmission of HIV. And then paragraph 33.11 Measures were taken to liaise with colleagues from other disciplines as and when necessary. A dermatologist, a neurologist and an infectious disease expert were all briefed and were willing to and did attend patients in the centre. In respect of general assistance, a liaison was also formed with the Sexually Transmitted Disease Department. They had many more HIV patients. And then if we turn to BHCT 40609, go to the next page. So this is a letter in relation to one patient. It's from June of 1994. I'm not proposing to go through the detail of it. We can see in the first paragraph, just over halfway down, she talks about, Dr. Main talks about her next visit to London, hoping to have some further consultation with experts there in the dermatological manifestations of HIV infection. And then there's a discussion about what treatment the patient should receive, and we see that continuing in the next paragraph, discussion about what treatment the patient should be on. And so, again, it's one example. There are other examples in the bundle of Dr. Main essentially being the primary clinician in relation to the haemophiliac HIV patients. If we go to HSOC 0010892, and we go to the third page, there's a letter from Dr. Main dated March the 2nd, 1994, which contains her comments on AZT. She says the advent of AZT was a therapeutic advance in the management of HIV. At the time of granting of its licence, I remember being particularly concerned about its side effects. And she sets out what she thought those would be. And then says, despite these reservations, I found it to be effective in treating HIV-positive patients whose CD4 counts were falling. I would admit, however, that I've never utilised the maximum recommended dose. Most patients in this centre have been treated intermittently rather than with permanent prophylaxis. I think patients can be reassured that the drug has a well-established role in treating certain aspects of HIV and AIDS, and she carries on. So again, it would appear decisions relating to the use of AZT from a clinical perspective were taken by Dr. Main. There is a description by Dr. Anderson picking up the picture a little later on, but in her witness statement, as I indicated a few minutes ago, of care being shared with an infectious diseases consultant. And again, Dr. Benson, I think, will be able to assist tomorrow in relation to the position as at 2008 and since in that regard. I turn then to the information that the inquiry has about the process of testing for hepatitis C and informing patients of their diagnosis. The themes which emerge from the evidence which the inquiry has received from people who were infected with hepatitis C or their relatives has a number of common themes. Some, not all, but some, describe being unaware of being tested for hepatitis C. A number of them draw attention to there being an apparently significant delay between date of testing, whether with the first test or a second generation test, and the patient themselves being informed of their diagnosis. Some recount an experience of only being told effectively when there's a significant event going on and they're attending the Haemophilia Centre, and then, as it were, told almost as an afterthought about the hepatitis C diagnosis. A further theme that emerges from the statement is of insufficient information being provided in terms of the nature of the virus, its likely consequences, treatment options and the like. And a final theme which emerges from the witness statements, some of the witness statements, is of a degree of false reassurance, or perhaps I should say over-optimistic reassurance about the nature of the condition. I want to start then, if I may, with looking at Dr. Main's various accounts of the position in relation to hepatitis C testing. So if we go first of all to WITN 0736001, and if we go first of all to, in fact, if we go first of all to page 6, if we look at paragraph 2.2, this is in fact on a slightly different point, but whilst we're looking at this statement, I should have drawn attention to it. So I referred earlier to the individual statements giving a near universal account of not being told about the risks of viral infection from their treatment, and to some recalling receiving the impression of it being a wonder drug or pioneering or a miracle treatment. And you'll see here Dr. Main responds to one individual witness statement. She says this, no warnings apart from vein care and aseptic techniques were given, because at that time, and we'll have to look back at Mr. Kirkpatrick's statement to check the particular time, I believe the treatment was both effective and safe. I certainly do not recall being asked about risks. The words wonder drug may have emanated from others, but not from me. I doubt if I would have dared to utter such words. So I should have referred to that. And then if we just get, returning then to the issue of hepatitis C testing, if we go on 2 pages, Shomik. We look at paragraph 3.2, should just refer probably back to 3.1. This is in response to an account of a patient being having their hepatitis C diagnosis communicated to them in a corridor. She says she doesn't recall it would not be my clinical practice to discuss patients' health in a corridor. And then more generally in relation to hepatitis C testing, she says this: precise laboratory testing for hepatitis C became the norm in 92 to 93, the virus having been identified in 1991. Now that latter date obviously is not correct.
No, it was 1988, but not published, I think, in detail until 1989.
Yes. And there is evidence of testing having been undertaken at the centre in 1991,
yes,
rather than 1992 to 93. Although
yes, this is talk about the norm, though.
Yes.
But it was introduced across the board, apparently, from the 1st of September 91.
Yes. And she says, it was not my clinical practice to test patients for hepatitis C without their consent. All patients attending the centre after receiving blood products were checked physically and had laboratory investigations. And then she goes on to talk about liver function tests. But in any event, that's the general statement in relation to the testing process. I should also draw attention to paragraph 3.4. Dr. Main says in the first sentence there was no specific test for hepatitis C available in 1987. That obviously is correct. And then she describes hepatitis C as not a prevalent concept in 87. It merely referred to the existence of abnormal liver function tests designated by the UK HCDO Hepatitis Working Party as non-A, non-B hepatitis. Well, I think the term non-A, non-B hepatitis is not attributable to the UK HCDO's Hepatitis C Working Party, but have been in common usage since at least the mid-1970s. But in any event, we see then, she says, in response to the patient saying she was not advised until 1993 of her hepatitis C diagnosis, Dr. Main says precise laboratory testing for hepatitis C only became available in 1992 to 1993. And if we then turn on 4 pages, I think, Shomik. To paragraph 5.4. Go this is part of Dr. Main's response here to an individual witness, here to the statement of Mr. Nigel Hamilton. Dr. Main says the diagnosis of hepatitis C was difficult as nearly all patients had evidence of abnormal liver function tests. She refers again to it being given the title non-A, non-B hepatitis, and then says definitive tests for hepatitis C were not available until 92 to 93. May, of course, turn on the use of the word definitive, but obviously there were tests available prior to that. So that's that witness statement. If we then go to WITN 0736005, if we go to the bottom of the second page, we can see in paragraph 2.1.1, there's a description in the second half of that paragraph to what was said to be the practice of the virology laboratory to keep a sample of serum to be retested in the future. She then, in paragraph 2.1.2, says the hepatitis C virus became isolated in 1991. We've already dealt with the incorrectness of that date. Tests became available to detect HCV antibody around that time, but tests for active HCV infection were not available until 1993. As far as I can recall, I believe the original 1976 sample was retested in 1991. In 1991, a further sample was taken and tested, and a further sample was taken and tested in 1993, making 3 tests in all. The customary length of time elapsed between testing and results becoming available. Patients were seen as soon as possible after their results were received for consultation and discussion. Present-day practice would require oral or written permission to carry out viral blood tests at the time in question, locally, nationally and internationally. Expediency seemed paramount, and specific consent was often not obtained, quite unlike the situation relating to HIV testing, when no test was ever carried out without consent of the patient. Refusal to have any test was acceptable at all times. Now again, there may potentially be much to unpick in that paragraph. Specific consent often not obtained, but it's then said refusal to have any test was acceptable at all times. Of course, if a patient doesn't know what they're being tested for, it may be a little difficult for them to exercise a right of refusal to the test. Picking up upon the dates given at the top of the page, you will no doubt recall, sir, from the hearing in Belfast and from the oral and written testimony overall from patients treated at this centre, there is evidence in medical records of tests being undertaken in 1991, but of patients not learning the results until some considerable time later, sometimes in 1992 or 1993, but sometimes much later. We've given a number of examples in the written note, and I'll refer to a handful of them. And if we look at the bottom of this page, we can see confirmation by Dr. Main of there being testing in 1991, because in relation to, again, another individual witness's account, she says the test in 1991 demonstrated that the witness had met the hepatitis C virus at some time. It showed that he had antibody but not active infection at the time of testing. He was clinically well. Top of the next page. Therefore, he was not informed about this particular result. It was thought it might cause undue anxiety and worry. At that time, it was unclear what the future would hold for someone with such a result. By 1993, a test became available which could detect active hepatitis C infection. It took time before the test came into routine use. The witness's definitive result of active infection was obtained in March 96 and confirmed in August 1996. It was now felt important that he should know the findings, hence the invitation to come and meet with the staff. So there is an example, but a fairly striking example in terms of the dates, of a patient tested in 1991, using the tests then available, a positive result, but the patient learning for the first time about a positive result following further testing 5 years later in 1996. And that's, as I say, one of a number of examples. Whilst we're looking at this witness statement, if we go to the paragraph a little further down, 2.4.1, again, a theme from the evidence has been Dr. Main's manner in providing information and diagnoses, and she responds here to a statement that described her as patronising and as not providing answers or the information that the patient was requesting. She says, there was a considerable degree of confusion at this time caused by the lack of precise knowledge as to how HCV would ultimately affect patients. I was fully aware of the situation as I travelled on a monthly basis to meetings in Scotland and also to other meetings in the UK and Europe. Specifically, I tried to bring back knowledge to Northern Ireland and relay it to the patients. It was not always easy to answer the patients' questions. It was felt better not to speculate about what might or might not happen in the future. It is regrettable that the witness found the presentation of the paucity of information patronising.
When she says it was felt better not to speculate, is she describing there her understanding of general practice derived from Scotland, Europe, etc., or is she describing her own practice by adopting the third person?
Grammatically, it could be either. I don't think we've heard evidence more generally to suggest it would be the former, and there's no particular material relating to Scotland, UK or Europe which she refers to. You obviously, sir, have encountered evidence of a range of different practices and approaches taken by clinicians at this time.
And do I have to take into account in looking at this my understanding of what was generally known about the prospects for those who had chronic infection?
Yes, absolutely.
As they were understood, at any rate, at the start of the 90s.
Yes. Well, at the start of, in the course of the 90s, because I don't know.
Well, that's why I said the start of the 90s. Yes. It covers the whole period.
Yes. Yeah. I don't know without checking Witness 1371 statement what the particular date was of this consultation. And then if we go a little further down the page, we just see the issue being raised at 2.6 and 2.61 about risks of HCV transmission during sexual intercourse. The witness records Dr. Main saying there was no risk of HCV transmission during unprotected sexual intercourse. Dr. Main's response is to say, I do not recall this part of our conversation, but the witness is probably correct. But at the time, I did not feel it was likely that HCV would be transmitted through unprotected intercourse. Again, there may be a difference between saying no risk and the question of whether it's likely or not. And then if we go to the top of the next page, this is again in response to a witness expressing concern about an absence of openness and transparency in the information provided about hepatitis C. Dr. Main's response is to say this paragraph underlines the need for the witness and her husband to have discussed these matters with experts. During the early 1990s, concerns regarding the implications of having HCV infection grew by leaps and bounds. Clinical symptoms were developing, and the most common complaint was of extreme lethargy. Therefore, in 1995, a residential weekend for all patients and centre staff was arranged, and then she provides details of the location, says it was fully sponsored by 9 international pharmaceutical companies, and she describes a number of experts, including virologists, coming to address the conference, and they made themselves available to individuals. She says in the next paragraph, I do not remember the witnesses being present at the residential weekend. At least I do not remember seeing or speaking with them on that occasion. If they were not present, it is sad, as they might have received much help and advice. There's no evidence that we've thus far uncovered of any, for those potentially majority of patients who didn't attend this particular conference, and there may of course be multiple reasons why patients would either not want to or not be able to. We've seen no evidence of the material from that conference being gathered and disseminated to non-attendees. And then if we go to If we go on another 3 pages, Shomik. Sorry, back 1 page, my fault. Bottom of this page. This is in response to a witness saying that they were not told about their HCV infection for 5 years, and a reference to blood samples being regularly taken in visits to hospital. Dr. Main says regular blood samples were taken from patients at all visits to the centre. This was to ensure they'd not developed an inhibitor to their own specific clotting factor, as this would alter their future management to a significant degree. As previously stated in earlier responses, samples from the 1970s were retained as was customary in the protocols of the Northern Ireland Virus Laboratory. And then the patient's final diagnosis of active HCV was not made until after the 1993 test was in routine use, i.e. in 1996. Prior to that time, he was designated as having non-A, non-B hepatitis. Now, it's not clear why a test which Dr. Main describes as being available from 1993 was not seemingly in routine use, to use her phrase, in the Belfast Centre until 1996. And then, if we go... no, in fact, we've looked at the next passage I was going to refer to already today. If we then turn to WITN 0736007, this is a further statement from Dr. Main in response to individual witness statements. We go to the second page, paragraph 5. So again, Dr. Main repeats the error about when HCV was identified. Then she says tests for antibody were available in 1993. Again, that doesn't appear to be right, but not indicative of active clinical infection. Tests for RNA viral loads were available in 94/95. The patient visited in 95 and therefore was not involved in any particular delay. He was seen as soon as possible in rotation with his fellow patients. And she says he was informed that the source of infection was his treatment. The evidence more generally suggests that there was no programme for calling patients in to be tested specifically for hepatitis C, or calling them back in to be informed of their test results as soon as those test results were available, or as soon as practicable after those test results became available. The evidence suggests that once hepatitis C testing was in use, it would be when the patient attended for a routine appointment that they might be tested. Again, there is some evidence from individuals of them being, the occasional evidence of being called in when there were special, in some individual special circumstances, but more generally that appears to have been the case. And then not being told the result for some considerable period of time. I think Dr. Main suggests it would have been at the next routine appointment, but certainly there were no special arrangements made for communicating the diagnosis prior to the patient's next general attendance, at least as a matter of general practice. There may, of course, have been individual symptoms. If we look at the bottom of this page, we can see a response from Dr. Main to the observation by a witness that she did not offer any support or counselling after informing him of the HCV diagnosis. She says neither support nor counselling were available. At that time, it was significantly problematic trying to establish a good clinic for hepatitis patients to attend. Additionally, as the witness's wife mentioned in her statement, we rather naively thought that hepatitis C was not so dire. Top of the next page, Dr. Main says this: many of the clinicians, myself included, could not in 1995 foresee how complex disastrous symptoms and complications of the virus would develop, sadly. And again, you'll need to assess that by reference to what you, sir, conclude a clinician could or should have understood in or by 1995. If we then go to WITN 0736009, and we go to page 41, we pick it up at the bottom of the page. At 62.1, Dr. Main asserts that patients infected with non-A, non-B hepatitis were informed of the existence of their abnormal liver function tests. At the time the condition was termed non-A, non-B, at that time, although patients had raised liver function tests, they were otherwise well. It doesn't say that they were told that they had non-A, non-B hepatitis. It doesn't say that they weren't, but what it says is that they were informed of the existence of the abnormal liver function tests. Then, next paragraph, she says it was not possible to inform patients of active hepatitis C infection until the specific blood test for this virus became available. If we go over to the top of the next page, she says it had been suspected for many years that regularly treated patients were likely to have the virus previously known as non-A, non-B hepatitis, subsequently known as hepatitis C. Patients had been attending the centre regularly for many years and receiving advice before the confirmation of their diagnosis. They were informed that they had a chronic viral infection of the liver that was causing inflammation. And again, there is evidence to contrary effect from some of the patients in their written statements to the inquiry. And then she refers to advice about alcohol consumption and diet. If we then go further down the page, she says, to the date given here in paragraph 63.1 is that the centre began testing patients for hepatitis C in 1993 when the test became available. So we do have a range of different tests, of course, a range of different dates. Of course, there were different tests being developed. She says in the next paragraph, all patients were routinely assessed for liver function and for unknown viruses up until the definitive test for active hepatitis C became available in 1993. And then towards the bottom of the page, picking it up, well, perhaps halfway down that paragraph, it says, patients were surprised at the clinical examination, but the abnormal test results were explained. They were told they did not have hepatitis B, a condition of which patients were well aware. Just pausing there, some statements relate patients not being aware that they had hepatitis B. Likewise, they knew they did not have any symptoms of hepatitis A, therefore they were not surprised when they were told that they probably had a condition called non-A, non-B hepatitis. And then if we go over the page, she continues in that paragraph about her views about the seriousness or otherwise of non-A, non-B hepatitis. And then 63.3 says this, some 3 to 4 years prior to the 1993 tests for hepatitis C antibody became available. So, start again. Some 3 to 4 years prior to 1993, tests for hepatitis C antibody became available. That test, if positive, only indicated that the individual had met the virus at some time. In a similar way, adults, if tested, would show the presence of anti-measles antibody, although, of course, they had no clinical evidence of the condition. During discussion with patients, they found it difficult to understand the explanation of having HCV antibody. Some were worried that I was keeping secrets from them. Just pausing there, again, a common theme from the witness statements is that they were not given this information about the results of early tests. Dr. Main continues, when the specific tests became available in 1993, the results indicated in many cases active disease. Even in 1993, it was difficult, even impossible, to give any precise prognosis or details of how the diagnosis may play out in time. As developments progressed, viral load testing became capable of the estimation of infection. Likewise, different subtypes of the virus were accurately diagnosable. At this time, a special liver clinic was established, and she gives a little more information about that. If we go over the page, In response to the question how many patients were infected with hepatitis C, her answer is in excess of 100. And then if we look at the third paragraph, 65.3, sorry, the third paragraph under the question in 65, she says this: with regard to HCV, the tests were done in batches to facilitate the effective management of the laboratory. The patients were informed at their next routine clinic visit. That may have been some time later. And the evidence certainly suggests, in many cases, a very significant gap of time in that regard. She says in 65.4, it's important to state that a positive antibody test required no action at this time. Positivity merely showed that at some time in the past the patient had been exposed to the virus, and she develops that theme. And then at the last paragraph on this page, the antibody tests were explained to patients at the next routine visit. The timing of routine reviews depended on the severity of the patient's condition. Those on home treatment or severely affected were seen on a monthly basis. The moderately severe were seen theoretically on a 6-monthly basis. I say theoretically because if they'd had no problems, they would cancel for perhaps a further 3 to 6 months. The very mildly affected were seen annually. And so the inquiry has evidence of patients who are not seen even annually. Now, that may have been a matter of patient choice, of course, but there doesn't appear to have been any arrangement for bringing those patients in for a period of testing. And we see some examples of testing a number of years later. Top of the next page, what Dr. Main says is that at a later date from late 1993 onwards, if their definitive test showed active disease, the patient was contacted and seen as soon as possible. Then management would proceed after discussion to the liver clinic and possible treatment with alpha interferon. It's not clear what's meant by the definitive test showing active disease, because there are individual accounts, and I think not disputed in Dr. Main's responses to them, of patients, for example, not being told their hepatitis C results until 1996 in some instances. So that's the account, the main account in Dr. Main's most recent and most detailed statement. We've looked at the example referred to in one of her earlier statements of testing in 1991, patient being informed in August 1996. We've given further examples in the written note, and of course, so you have all the individual statements available to you to consider. Perhaps one or two further examples may be worth looking at for present general purposes. So if we go to WITN 257001, this is an example, if we go to the third page. So WITN 257001, sorry. If we go to the second page, in fact, first of all. So if we pick it up at paragraph 5 towards the bottom of the page, this is an example of a patient account of them being invited to go in for screening because of a brother's diagnosis of hepatitis C. And then if we go to the next page, we can see in paragraph 4.1, patients saying that they were given their diagnosis in 2003 after, I think it was the brother's death in 2002. So that's one example. There are then accounts that we have, and again we've sought to summarise them in our written note, of some witnesses only becoming aware of relatives' hepatitis C infections after the patient had died, or some only becoming aware in recent years of hepatitis C infections, and we may hear some relevant evidence from Dr. Benson in relation to that tomorrow. If we go to WITN 1382001, and again, these are just examples of some of the broader themes that emerge. And we go to the 4th page. I've referred already to a theme about patients not being given what they regarded as sufficient or adequate information, or being given over-optimistic reassurance. And we see in paragraph 18, I should say this is an example of a patient asking to be tested and being told their diagnosis in 1992. So tests clearly were available earlier than the dates that Dr. Main's other statements might suggest. And then in paragraph 18, I was told by Dr. Main that despite my hepatitis C, I would probably have a long and normal life, and that it was just a risk of having factor VIII. Dr. Main did not discuss any of the potential health issues. She just brushed over it very quickly. She did not discuss any treatment, although there wasn't any available then, or provide any advice on how to manage and understand the infection. She simply told me that I had it, and it would do me no harm. So that's one example. And then if we go to WITN 2569001, we go over the page. So this is another account of a and it may, I think, be a sibling potentially of one of the statements we've already looked at, but I'm not sure of that. But we see again an invitation in paragraph 4, bottom half of the page, to being screened following a brother's death from hepatitis C. And if we go to the next page, at paragraph 4.1, the witness says in the second line, there was a time when I didn't attend hospital for a number of years. That was because I wasn't sent for. I think this was between 1997 and 2003. Hepatitis C was only mentioned to me after my brother's death. And then if we go over 2 pages, top of the next page, I wasn't offered any support or counselling at the time of being diagnosed. I think if I'd been offered counselling on how to manage this infection, I doubt I'd be suffering with depression now. The only information offered was not to share my razor. I was informed of my diagnosis in a clinical manner and felt there was little empathy for me. And then if we just look at a couple of letters from Dr. Main on the issue of hepatitis C. So first of all, WITN 2655002. This is a letter from Dr. Main, April 1992, about a particular patient, Richard Lowry, and you'll no doubt, so I'm sure, remember the evidence of his widow in Belfast, mildly affected haemophiliac. And if we look at the bottom of the page, we can see Dr. Main saying in the last 4 lines, he's had elevation of his liver enzymes for a number of years. This is related most likely to infections with hepatitis C virus. His results vary between 2 and 3 times the normal range of values. So April 92, Dr. Main feeling able in this case to articulate a diagnosis of, or likely diagnosis of hepatitis C. Over the page, She says in the second line, hepatitis C is an unknown quantity to some degree. Between 80 and 90% of treated haemophiliacs are known to be positive. All are clinically well. From liver biopsy specimens obtained in some centres, it would appear that a small percentage of patients may ultimately develop cirrhosis or chronic active hepatitis. Perhaps a particularly difficult letter to read now in light of what we know happened to this gentleman. But there's Dr. Main setting out her apparent understanding of the condition in April 1992. If we then turn to WITN 1382003, second page. This is a letter at the end of 1992, the 21st of December 1992. It's in relation to one of the witnesses whose statements we looked at, who said she was led to believe that the hepatitis C wasn't a problem. And this, I think, would appear to confirm the accuracy of her recollection, because if we look at the bottom paragraph, it says, I've explained to Anne that there are several viruses which cause positivity to hepatitis C. Generally, it's thought that it's very unlike hepatitis B infection, and it may not have any serious sequelae for liver function in the future. Presently, Professor Eric Preston and other colleagues in the Haemophilia Centre Directors Organisation are carrying out an assessment of the benefit received by a 6-month course of alpha interferon. The results to date are quite promising, and if Anne's test suggests that she should fit into this category, I'll discuss it further with the patient and with yourself. So that is apparently Dr. Main's understanding in December 1992 of the nature of hepatitis C.
Well, it's what she wrote.
It's what she wrote.
But it doesn't quite fit with what she wrote on the 15th of April, 92.
No,
in the last letter about Richard Larry.
Yes, and it doesn't quite fit with what we've heard of more generally.
It doesn't.
About the position.
It doesn't easily reconcile with that.
And then just picking up on the point in relation to interferon, we can see from this that was, again, just as we've seen HIV infection being treated by Dr. Main, we see in the early years, at least in the 1990s, Dr. Main taking responsibility for the treatment of those of her patients who had by that time been diagnosed with hepatitis C. We see the letter in relation to Richard Lowry that we looked at also refers to her offering interferon treatment as at April 1992. So she was taking it upon herself at that stage, as indeed we've heard other haemophilia clinicians were doing, should make that clear, to be the treating clinician in relation to this virus. We saw the reference in one of Dr. Main's earlier statements to seeking a degree of specialist input. And if we go to, this is in relation to hepatitis C, if we go to WITN 0736001, and we go to paragraph 6.2, which is page 13, I think. And we pick it up in paragraph 6.2. So this is in response to Simon Hamilton's witness statement. She says in 6.2, up until the hepatitis C virus was identified in 1991, no one really knew what to expect, etc. Always I had an ominous feeling about the virus, she says. And then she refers to the weekend meeting in 1995 and exhibits a programme for that. And then she says in the last sentence, thereafter, so at some point after the weekend in 1995, a combined haemophilia/hepatitis clinic was established in the centre under the aegis of Dr. Callender, consultant hepatologist in the Royal Victoria Hospital. There's also reference, if we go to WITN 0921001, This is the statement of Dr. McNulty. Go to page 5. No, sorry, page 7. We know Dr. Main retired in 1999, and we've seen the reference to her setting up a joint clinic. If we look at paragraph 3.16 in Dr. McNulty's statement, there we go, thank you. We can see she's referring in the last sentence, there were many discussions between me and Dr. Jones, and he took over as acting director when Dr. Main retired, at that time as we were trying to set up a regular joint hepatology/haemophilia clinic and were in regular contact with the hepatologist to press our case. So the position in relation to when such a clinic was established is not entirely clear. Dr. Anderson, in her statement, describes when she arrived there being limited hepatology input only, and that being a particular concern of hers. And she's described that in some considerable detail in her witness statement. And again, no doubt Dr. Benson will be able to assist us tomorrow with the position in terms of hepatology care, at least in general terms, from 2008 onwards. So that's the summary of the material relating to testing and providing information about diagnosis to patients in relation to hepatitis C, sir. If I can then pick up on a slightly different theme, which is that of record keeping. Now, we've said in our presentation note that a number of patients report difficulty in obtaining their medical records or not having complete medical records, and that's absolutely right. But we've suggested in our note that the general processes in relation to record keeping are presently unknown. In fact, we do have some information about record keeping, which I should have referred to. First of all, Dr. Anderson, in her statement, perhaps, I think you have this, Shomik, it's WITN 4027001. And if we go to page 16, it's a very long statement. As I should say, Dr. Anderson joined Belfast Centre in November 2000, and we'll see, sorry, it's page 16, not 60, my apologies. We'll see her description of the state of medical records at 6.8.23 of her statement. She says medical records were handwritten and kept meticulously. There was excellent administrative and secretarial support, and it followed that the filing was good, with the medical records kept within dividers in the case notes and any written results filed in separate sections. And she says in the last sentence of that paragraph, these case records were of a superior quality to those I'd seen at many other institutions I'd worked at previously. And then she describes in the next paragraph the medical records being kept within the day ward records department, in a separate section to other records belonging to other haematology patients, and then describes the transfer because the hospital the centre relocated. And so she describes the transfer of records, which she says she personally oversaw at the time of the centre's relocation. And then bottom of the page, she describes introducing a typed record of all patients attending for day case assessment. Of course, that would have only been from November 2000 or whatever date she introduced it onwards, and wouldn't relate to the quality of the notes at an earlier stage. That's Dr. Anderson describing the notes as she found them. And then we do have a more general statement about record keeping within the trust. Shomik, this is the document you should have received today. So it's WITN 3449007. This is a statement of Caroline Leonard for the Belfast Health and Social Care Trust. And if we go to we go perhaps just to the last page. So there's a description of what archives the Trust hold and a history given of the Trust's archiving system. And then we see an account. Oh, I'm sorry, can we go to the page prior to that? Thank you. We see a description there of retention and destruction policies and processes from 1948 to date. And I'm not going to go through the detail of what are, I think, a number of exhibits, but I just draw attention to the fact that there's said to be, or there is a retention and disposal schedule. It's said to be based upon the principles contained within a Department of Health guidance, that's paragraph 5.2, and she refers to policy being adopted by the Trust, and then she says at 5.3, prior to this, records were retained and or disposed of in accordance with the Trust and Legacy Organisation's retention and destruction policy that was in place at the relevant time. And then there are a range of Northern Irish circulars that are referred to relevant to the question of document retention and document destruction. And then we look in paragraph 5.4, so if we just go further down the page, we see reference to a suspension of the destruction of any records in August 2015. That was in response to the historical institutional abuse inquiry, and we're told that suspension of destruction of records continues to remain in place. Now, there's a lot more detail there that will need to be unpicked at an appropriate stage. But having said in the written note that the general processes in relation to record keeping are presently unknown, that wasn't a fair characterisation of the fact that we have also got this material. How Ineovith then explains individual missing records is an exercise that we'll have to undertake to the extent that we are able to do so. And it may be that Dr. Benson may be able to assist us again tomorrow with what at least the position's been since he has been director of the service. Then in terms of the provision of information more generally to third parties, so I note the time. I've still got a handful of matters I need to deal with, so it will be more than a few minutes, so perhaps we could take a break at this point.
Yes, certainly. Roughly how long do you think you have left?
Half an hour?
Yes. Well, we'll take a break now until 3:45.
Thank you, sir.